Many are familiar with the Bermuda Triangle as an area in the western part of the North Atlantic Ocean, well known for the mysterious disappearances of a number of aircraft and sea vessels, as well as their occupants. Jean, a vacationer who went on a snorkeling excursion within the Bermuda Triangle, managed to escape its potentially dangerous wrath, only to emerge with a possible clue to what could have been a past life during the civilization of Atlantis. An intriguing account, to be sure. We weighed in with noted hypnotherapist, past life regressionist, and author Dr. Bruce Goldberg to try and make sense of this otherwise anomalous and mystifying encounter. What he has to say just might give us all pause for thought on the true nature of spiritual growth and our evolution both individually and as a species. Dr. Bruce Goldberg, it's been quite a few months since we saw each other. Actually, not too long ago. I think it was back in February where we had a wonderful discussion about the out-of-body experience and conscious dying, a fascinating topic. But today we're going to get into something a little bit different. It has to do with a woman's account. Her name is Jean, in which she traveled on vacation to Bimini Island off of in the Bahamas, just off the coast of Bimini Island, and had an extraordinary experience of which she believes she had a brush with perhaps a past life in Atlantis. And so I know you've read the story, and I really want to just get into the nuts and bolts of this. Maybe we can do a little bit of an overview based on your understanding of the story and really just get into the mechanisms at work here.
Well, the Bimini Road is, of course, the classic prediction that Edgar Cayce made in the 30s, saying that before 1968 or 69, that the Bimini Road, which was an example of Atlantis, would rise above it or be discovered to show that there was actual evidence of Atlantis. Well, Cayce made that prediction in the late 30s, and of course in 1969 they discovered the Bimini Road, and that made him even more world famous than he was. But the most important part of this is not just the Bimini Road. Yes, that is a perfectly depicted road that people say, well, it was done by nature. No, it isn't, because it's too symmetrical, and nature doesn't work that way, especially when you're underwater. But the most important part is the Bermuda Triangle aspect of this and the energy vortex that the Bermuda Triangle represents. Mm-hmm. Now, in the field of not just metaphysics, but actually geophysics too, we have a term that's called ley lines, L-E-Y, ley lines. Ley lines are very important because they represent energy centers. These ley lines on a physical level are actually tears in the fabric of space-time, and they can explain many occurrences like time slips, which is relevant to this case, and teleportation, and a whole bunch of fun stuff. Some of the most famous examples of ley lines and doing things like this are Glastonbury in England, where you had people seeing literally a scene of King Arthur, Joseph of Arimathea, etc. Tourists have reported just being levitated and teleported when they go to these sites, if you will. So these are examples of what the Bermuda Triangle represents. Mm-hmm. We have, literally 1,000 or so missing crafts and all kinds of things that have occurred in the Bermuda Triangle. Well, the Bermuda Triangle is also the location of Atlantis. I mean, the Bimini Road is just an example of that. So we must always consider and bear in mind the concept of ley lines, geophysical forces, and tears in the fabric of space-time as we go into this case. Mm-hmm. Now, the interesting thing about this is that these ley lines, by the way, run all around the planet. So you have like the Egyptian pyramids, I mentioned Glastonbury, and the various what we call megalith structures all throughout Europe and around the world are actually lined up along these ley lines. So there is a very physical explanation to this. The 1920s businessman and amateur archaeologist Alfred Watkins was the one who actually laid these out in detail, and that, of course, has been documented. Now, getting back to this particular case, what you have here is an example of both ley lines, you have an example of the energy vortex here, and you even have an example of teleportation. Now, what was interesting about this case to begin with, you have so many factors that go beyond the logic, go beyond what we call coincidence, which I don't believe in any way, especially with this particular case. When Jean was in the Logan Airport in Boston,
yes,
she runs across a book on the Bimini Road. Now, Logan Airport, I've been there, okay? This is not an Atlantic offshoot.
That's right.
Major metropolitan international airport. You go all over the world. They have books. People go there and they may have books about going to Paris or Rome or New York or whatever. That's fine, but it's not likely to find a Bimini Road.
That's right. And she actually made reference to that immediately. She said, and she said the same thing. How is it that, this book practically fell off the shelf? I was basically just looking for a read for the plane. And so she had a sense, obviously in retrospect, that there was some sort of precognition, if you will, as to what she was about to experience. May I ask you one question before we get really into this? Because I know you're going to go in this direction in any case. You're really picking up on the theme here. But I want to get right into what happened to her and how immediate this was in terms of her seeing, and I'm noticing you're pronouncing it Bimini versus Bimini. I don't know what the proper pronunciation is, but Bimini Road. When she and her snorkeling partner got into the water, Bruce, immediately something took place. She was obviously at the surface of the water, whereas accounts of Bimini Road are at the bottom, which is perhaps hundreds of feet deep. So one would surmise that they went into an altered state the moment they hit the water. Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, it may be beyond just the altered state. Remember now, the other members of this little team, of this little crew there that was observing doing their little snorkeling, let's call it the snorkeling team, they observed them throughout this entire experience of being on the surface, being just a few feet below the water with their snorkelers. I go snorkeling, and you don't snorkel 100 feet down.
That's right.
Unless you got a scuba gear on you. So according to everybody else on the Earth plane in our current universe and our dimension, etc., they were just doing what everybody else was doing, snorkeling a few feet below the water, coming up for air, whatever, or at least just snorkeling and hanging out like everybody else. Nothing was unusual from the other observers. That's important. Now, this is more than just an altered state. Yes, you could say they were in an altered state or a natural hypnotic level, a daydream level, but in reality, there may have been some teleportation involved here, too, because what happened is that, remember, the issue here was they both had similar but not exactly the same experiences, which you will expect. When you're in an altered state, it's a subjective phenomenon. It's not objective. So two people will not have the exact same experiences. And I'm going to report or describe shortly after we go into this one another very famous case showing you similar patterns of how two very credible witnesses reported an amazing experience in the Palace of Versailles about 100 years ago. But getting back to this one, the issue here, let's not forget, Jean was very much, she hung out with this woman, Alice, was like her best friend or a partner during this experience. Then this Lisa person, completely out of character, stands up when they're going to choose partners and said, "You're my partner."
That's right.
And she's not an aggressive person, and she was, 7 months pregnant too, which is going to be relevant here in a moment. So that was also another example of a synchronicity or something that is beyond the usual levels because it's out of character. Now, the idea of Atlantis, which, of course, the Bimini Road, and by the way, whether you call it Bimini or Bimini depends upon whether you're Atlantean or whether you're American, okay? Okay. There is an accent situation. C'est la vie. But what Jeannie was reporting, though, was not just the Bimini or Bimini Road. She was reporting the hills, the trees, the gateway. These are very significant reports. Something that you don't just see by somebody say this is a natural rock formation. She's reporting, actually observing the continent, the lost continent of Atlantis. And I write about this in my books, how these trees and gateways are very relevant to the structure of what Atlantis actually existed. But it gets even more relevant. Jeannie describes a pull in her mind, not a physical force so much, but more like an internal pull, which would be characteristic as why teleportation becomes relevant here, because that's what happens. You have an internal, subjective, in-the-mind kind of mentality that precedes things such as levitation, which is a predecessor to teleportation. Now, what was interesting is Jeannie wasn't aware of the snorkel or her fins, but breathes easily. Well, you don't do that when you're snorkeling. I snorkel. Okay, you got to be concerned about your air. Another example. Now, Lisa makes it even more relevant. Lisa was 7 months pregnant, and she was crying during this experience. If you remember the story,
right.
She was crying, and it was more tears of kind of joy because her unborn son, the fetus of 7 months old, right, was communicating with Lisa during the experience. And you say, well, why is that? Is that just a woman's mentality? You could say that, but then what's really relevant about this is that the unborn infant, the fetus, described that they all had a past life in Atlantis, and he said his name, well, she said will be Solon. It probably was his Atlantean name.
And I think he did say that his name was Solon, at the time of Atlantis, and probably encouraged her to name him Solon. Yes.
I don't know too many Solons in this life, but it's a very important name because Solon, which your audience may not be familiar with, was actually the name of Plato's grandfather.
Oh, my goodness.
Who was the man who, when he went to Egypt, as all the Greeks did go to Egypt in the old days, 2,400 years ago, give or take, Solon was his grandfather, he was the one who received the story of Atlantis from the Egyptian priests. And, of course, Plato documented that in his famous work. And he's the only ancient writer that described Atlantis. So Solon was is also a great man. Plato came from a very interesting family. So now Solon, the unborn fetus of Lisa, says that they all lived in Atlantis, which they probably did. This is why this whole thing is relevant. Lisa never saw the gate. See, now you have a different experience.
That's right, yes.
Okay? All right, now, remember, the Bermuda Triangle is an energy vortex. And so, therefore, these experiences represent not just the idea of going into an altered state and reviewing, let's say, the Atlantis and maybe bits and pieces of a past life, but the whole experience is a dimensional shift to them, you see? Mm-hmm. Even though people are seeing them on the surface or, diving in, from their perspective, they're in a completely different issue here. So I just want to compare this and contrast this with a very famous experience to show you how this is relevant and how this is not such an unusual phenomenon. We can call these time slips, which again represents tears in the fabric of space-time. So let me just give you another quick case to show you the similarity, yet it's a different geographical location. In August of 1901, two English teachers went on holiday to Paris, right? Mm-hmm. These women were Anne Moberly, a principal of St. Hugh's College in Oxford, and a Dr. Elena Jourdain. They visited the Palace of Versailles and began looking for what's called the Petit Trianon, which is a small chateau in Versailles that was given to Marie Antoinette by Louis XVI in 1774. As they wandered around the grounds, they both felt strange and observed two men dressed in long grayish-green coats with small three-cornered hats, which would be the style of dress of the 18th century. And remember, this is 1901. These men directed the ladies to the Petit Trianon. Okay. As they approached the small country house with shuttered windows and terraces on either side, a woman was sitting on the lawn with her back to the house. This woman wore a summer dress and a large white hat and was drawing on a large sheet of paper. The English teachers recognized this woman as Marie Antoinette. Now, another fact that made these women, shall we say, observe it with exclamation here, was the music that they heard during this experience. They wrote it down, and along with the sketches of the Petit Trianon, as it appeared in 1774, not as it appears in 1901. All right, now, what happens is that when they reported this incident after this, nobody at the time believed their story, and when they returned home, experts said that no such music ever played, no, it never existed, etc. Well, research revealed that on October 5th, 1789, Marie Antoinette had been at the Petit Trianon when she first learned that Paris was marching toward the palace. Recently, music manuscripts in Paris were found that had been composed for Marie Antoinette's 34th birthday in 1789 and played on that day. The music was identical to what the school teachers reported. They couldn't possibly have known that from any current sources or any research sources because nobody knew that music existed until almost 100 years later. The journal that was uncovered, written by one of the ladies of Marie Antoinette's court, like a lady attendant, this is what one entry read. That two women dressed in strange clothes wandered unexpectedly onto the grounds. The features of the landscape described by the two English ladies match those which existed in 1789, not 1901. So here's an example of two English teachers, Oxford, we're talking about a highly credible reputation, both of them.
Sure.
And they reported literally transporting from 1901 to 1789. That would be teleportation, not just an altered state. They literally described not only the music, the Marie Antoinette, the way she was dressed, and this and that, and their presence was reported in a diary by one of the attendants of Marie Antoinette. So here's an example of a time slip / teleportation that, in principle, mimics almost exactly what Jean and Lisa experienced here.
That is phenomenal. Well, Bruce, I think I have heard of this account of these two individuals. You said this was in 1901, correct?
Right. 1901 is when this occurred. Now, I should tell you, too, that in 1901, in August, when this occurred, there were many electrical storms throughout Europe that summer, and the electrical storms would be symbolic, or one of the mechanisms in which you can actually facilitate the tear of the fabric of space-time.
Absolutely.
That's another incident. Secondly, beyond this experience, in the 1940s or 50s, in the same location, other people have reported similar experience without knowing who these women were, because when they wrote about this wasn't exactly a best-selling book, okay? Their experiences were basically unknown to the world. They reported it at the time, in 1901, and but this is 50 years later when other people had the experiences. They couldn't possibly have read about it or have known about it, so we have independent corroboration of the experiences.
Right.
Lisa and Jean's experience are corroborated too. Remember, they're not identical. As the two women in the Palace of Versailles, their experiences weren't identical either. They were similar. Mm-hmm. Describe some of the biggie aspects that I just, or some of the more exotic and symbolic aspects were reported, but from a different perspective, and there were differences in their stories. So it wasn't like, if you're going to try to fake something, you're going to have an identical experience. It would be like two people giving alibis to a murder.
Right. Well, I have no doubt that this was an authentic experience for them.
Oh,
Bruce,
well, for what you're describing, I don't doubt it either. But I'm just showing you it's an example.
Right. Absolutely.
Of a tear in the fabric of space-time, ley lines, if you will. You can say an altered state of consciousness, but also a potential teleportation aspect of this. For example, I was talking about some of the other examples. There's a place in England. It's called the Chanctonbury Ring. It's an ancient earthwork circle in the south coast of England. This former Anglo-Saxon fort is located at the nodal intersection of 5 ley lines. And on August 25th, 1974, a William Lincoln, an American tourist, was lifted 5 feet up into the air, suspended horizontally for 30 seconds. Physically impossible, okay? Before returning to the ground, 3 of his friends witnessed the event. These are examples of what can happen during these ley lines. The Cydonia area of Arizona is another major energy vortex. So they're all over the world. So these experiences are facilitated by the actual geophysical events of these ley lines, and things occur here that do not normally occur in your day-to-day life. So this story with Jean and Lisa is just another example, a very dynamic one, but that's something that can be explained by both metaphysical and geophysical laws.
Right. I want to ask a couple questions. Sure. You're touching on so many crucial points here. Let's go back and talk a little bit, Bruce, about this sort of blending of or blurring of time slips and teleportation. Now, what you're saying is that you believe that their experience was far more physical, maybe, than a traditional altered state, if you will. But where is that demarcation between time slip and teleportation? I guess I'm not necessarily clear on that. In other words, the people that were still in the boat were able to physically see their heads, bobbing up and down in the water with a snorkel, and yet their experience was one in which they they knew themselves to be somewhere else. Where is that? I'm a little confused about that aspect.
Okay, there are 2 major disciplines that can be incorporated. If they were observed continuously, in other words, nobody lost sight of them, and I didn't read that in the report, whether people were just like staring at them for this experience because they would be looking at other people too.
Right.
But if they were observed, let's assume case 1, where they were observed consistently, never disappearing, and just always being there, okay? That would not be teleportation. What that would be an out-of-body experience or astral traveling. Mm-hmm. See, where now they're sending their astral body to observe the gateway and the hills, etc., especially in Jean's case. So if they're sending their consciousness, their soul's energy occupying a spiritual body, this would be the astral body. And people in the old days would describe it as astral projection. We call that simply out-of-body experiences today, or remote viewing is another actually disappeared, that would be a physical teleportation. And the reason I look upon, either way, they're significant. Yes, the teleportation would be more exotic. But remember, the key issue in Jean's case with her report was that she describes herself breathing underwater. You see, now she's not a fish, okay? So the point is in doing that, that would be an example of, let's say, assuming it's just an out-of-body experience rather than teleportation, she would be now on the ground in Atlantis at least 12, 13,000 years ago. That's when it went down, supposedly for the last time. They went down 3 times. And so therefore, it's not just an underwater experience to her. She's now actually going back in time, okay, time traveling to thousands of years ago, and literally observing it maybe from the air, so to speak, as you could call it, rather than the water, what Atlantis looked like and how it appeared before it went down.
Well, she said that when she was in the water, of course, she at some point didn't sense any equipment on her. She was just, the snorkeling equipment, of course, but she was in the water fully submerged, and she this is how she believed herself to be a lot deeper than she was in actuality. She said she could see water, on all sides of her, and she could not see the surface of the water. But here's another point I want to make. I'd like you to elaborate on. I think we touched on this, and that is when she was approaching this gate, and by the way, she describes this gate as being crumbly, as if it were very, very old. So I don't know that she was necessarily viewing Atlantis as it was, but the remnants as it was. That gate, sort of a Gothic style gate, she described. But so invariably she had this pull that she described as more of a mental versus a physical pull, a mental sort of conjuring toward that gate, and she felt that on the other side of that gate was something very familiar to her. Concurrently, however, she received a physical pull back. There were 2 things going on simultaneously: a luring toward the gate, which she felt compelled to do, but then a physical, she said, I would have had to swim so hard to get through this physical block that was trying to prevent me. And she also heard a voice say, don't do that. That would not be wise for you to do. So what was going on there?
Okay, well, remember now, the pull that she's describing is very commonly reported in both out-of-body experiences, when people are going to leave their body, as well as in teleportation experiences, okay? That is not uncommon. In fact, it's a very common. I write about that in my books, and other people have done that too. Now, so that's one thing. Secondly, the idea of the seeing Atlantis, the gate being crumbling, and therefore maybe it's a more modern depiction versus what it was thousands of years ago, would not fit into current mentality because, believe me, the Bimini or Bimini Road, however you want to pronounce it, has been observed and played around since 1969. Scientists, using sonar equipment, would have gotten the gate by now, okay? If it was down there, so obviously, only because it was old, it would have been discovered, just like they pulled up, old ships, etc. So that's why I don't think that she was observing a gate as it exists today, because that would have definitely been reported. People have...
I agree with
all
you.
kinds of research is there for 40 years plus. Now, so the pull thing, again, is common to both out-of-body experiences, which is not a teleportation because you're using your spiritual body and your soul occupying what we call a spiritual body, versus teleportation, which is your actual physical body. The voice is interesting because that could be her spirit guide or her higher self, instructing her not to do anything that would be dangerous or not to do anything that would compromise her physical presence in her body today. You see, when you're traveling out of the body, so let's assume it's an out-of-body experience, okay? If you're traveling out of the body, it's a perfectly safe experience. We do that every day, literally. When we go to sleep at night and we dream, we're actually doing out-of-body experiences. That's been documented. People, when they have natural, spontaneous out-of-body experiences for various reasons, you always have, when you do that, you have your higher self helping you, advising you, so you don't do anything stupid and you don't compromise yourself. And she was reporting that. She was given advice internally from another source. I would suspect it was her higher self. And this all fits into experiences that are very common, actually. People, you have reports not just of famous people like, Joan of Arc, etc., channeling various saints, but people get a little voice in their head. They're not schizophrenic. This is not uncommon to have a little intuition or some sort of inspiration internally to guide you along in life. In this case, there are things that she could have done to physically harm herself. Had she dove down maybe 50 or 100 feet and then ripped off her mask, she would have been in trouble. You see,
right.
So that internal voice was most likely her higher self, just kind of supervising her and guiding her and protecting her, yet at the same time maximizing her metaphysical experience.
Right. Well, again, though, in addition to the voice that was telling her no, she, again, felt a physical sensation of something holding her back. But here's something that I found interesting, and I asked her this question. We know about the accounts of planes and boats and, of course, people gone missing, never to be found again. And so I said to her, Jean, if indeed you felt that you could have pushed through that force that was holding you back and swam through that gate, do you think that possibly you would have been one of those people missing as well? It seems to me that there's some common features with this. We don't know why certain people will have these experiences in return. Others get sort of sucked into this vortex, if you will. I would love to get your weigh in on that. Might she have gone missing if she went through that gate?
Well, we don't really know because, you have so many reported, by the way, the Bermuda Triangle, there's a Pacific equivalent. You have Canadian examples. You have other examples of places that act like the Bermuda Triangle, too. We don't know the origin of those forces. Scientists have been playing around with this for the last 60 or 70 years. But I don't think so. I think her higher self, both her and Lisa, they were supposed to survive this experience, to report it. With you as a help, a counsel here. So I think that she was really never really endangered, and she was being protected by her higher self anyway along this. So would she be another statistic for the Bermuda Triangle? I doubt it. Maybe it would have been possible, but it wasn't in her stars, so to speak, or her destiny. So she was, again, supposed to, just like the case in the Palace of Versailles. These two women could have been lost in the space-time continuum or with their teleportation and never have returned to 1901. And no one would have happened. They would have just been missing, just like a ship in the Bermuda Triangle. So I think there's a reason why these people do survive, and this is just another example. So her and Lisa were supposed to survive and report this, and I don't really know how much physical danger she was in. We'll never know because, again, you can't put a video camera on. This is exactly what happened. And remember, we're talking about laws that are not just physical laws. We're talking about vortices. This is like a black hole in a way, all the physical laws that we know of don't exist in a black hole.
That's right.
Singularity,
Yeah.
You're in no man's land. So we don't really know. This is not an exact science, nor can we measure it from an objective perspective as we can other physical laws.
Right. So now we're talking about, it was not necessarily their destiny to be lost. Obviously it wasn't. But what about, Bruce, all of those that have gone missing? You mentioned lost in space, in the space-time continuum. Where are these people?
Well, there's a famous case that occurred in Tennessee, not far from Nashville, Tennessee, of a David Lang who, this was like 1880-something, and he was on a farm with his family. He had a wife and a couple of kids. And there was a man coming in a horse and carriage. It was actually a judge, a local judge, and it was, I believe, his brother-in-law. And they were coming in to visit to have lunch with him, I guess it was. So David Lang goes out. He's out in the fields. And all of a sudden, the wife is looking at him, and she's preparing lunch, and she's looking at her husband, and she sees through the, as she looks beyond him, she can see this horse and carriage coming up with the judge, and I guess it was her brother. And all of a sudden, David, the father here, and husband, disappears. Just right before her eyes. She was the witness. It just disappeared. Well, of course, the judge and the brother-in-law, they saw him disappear too, so they called in the local, geophysical government representatives, the people to check things out. They were looking to see whether there was some sort of a fall in the earth there, where he may have fallen into like quicksand or something. Nothing. The ground was perfectly hard. Everything was fine, and they couldn't find him. And by the way, he never returned. This is an example of teleportation where he's in the fifth dimension somewhere and we don't know where he is. Well, what happened was that there was about a 15-foot circular area where he disappeared, that insects would not be there, okay? It was like the horses wouldn't go on that part of the ground. It was like a no man's land. And the children who would play around the area, they were like 8, 9 years old, they would hear his voices. And the voices got lower and lower and lower, and eventually they heard nothing. So here's an example of a man spontaneously entered into a tear in the fabric of space-time, teleported into what we would call the fifth dimension, which is beyond our physical eyes that can only see three dimensions, and he never returned. So this is a guy who did not pass go, do not come back, he was gone. Now that's a very rare example because most of the examples of teleportation, people do come back and they're perfectly safe, but there are examples, just like in the Bermuda Triangle, where crafts, I mean, we're talking about, the famous one was during World War II, and a couple of Navy planes, 1943, were doing a routine, leaving Fort Lauderdale, doing a routine exercise and never were seen again. Okay, and there were many others, but that's the famous one because that's been reported like a zillion times. Right. And of course, the Navy investigated this for weeks. So my point is, we don't really know these forces. These are unknown forces. Again, you can't measure them like in a physics lab. These are considered to be energy vortices, and we just don't know. All we can do is guess. There's no mathematical models to depict this, and there's no other forms of investigation that we can use to determine exactly what happens, just like we don't really know what happens in a singularity or a black hole. We have theories and we have mathematical projections, but nobody's been in the middle of it to witness it and say, hey, guess what I reported? Here's my notebook,
Right. Do you think we'll ever know, Bruce? Do you think we'll ever understand these technologies?
Well, in my Egypt book, where I talk about time travelers from the year 3,000 years in the future to between 1,000 and 3,000 years in the future, I'm sure by that time, with our advanced technology, they'll have a much better depiction of what's going on. But our current scientists, there's no way they can know. All they can do is guess.
Sure.
Because we do have mathematical models, but the mathematical model is not the same thing as the actual observation of the experience from a subjective point of view with an objective principle behind it, you see.
I think
you can't do it in these cases. All these experiences, by definition, metaphysical experiences are like religious experiences. They're subjective. You can't put them on a dot in a graph. No two people are going to have the same experience.
That's right. And I think science is slowly beginning to yield to that fact, in that, you talk about the observer being integral in the outcome of the experiment. As we know in quantum mechanics, quantum physics, that they have had to allow for that as a very, very integral part of experiments and the outcomes of the experiments. So I think we're starting to see a very slow yield to that possibility.
No, remember, from a scientific point of view, when you deal with physicists, and I deal with them, they hate quantum physics. Quantum mechanics is considered to be philosophical. They think it's Socrates and Plato having a conversation. Yet, we have mathematical models to depict quantum mechanics. We have the M theory, we have the five-string theories, which the M theory combines all five together. So, and your quantum physics is your barcodes, it's your computers, it's your space program. Quantum mechanics is a major part of technology today, so you can't argue that. You definitely can't argue the math. But here's the point. Remember the rule of thumb. As scientists like to make fun of this field, metaphysics in general, New Age mentality, metaphysics always precedes physics. The first science in mankind's history was astrology. Okay, astrology is a science of probability granted, but it's based upon logarithm. It's a mathematical-based mentality. It's not just channeling some entity from the planet Zuma here. There are physical or mathematical and scientific principles behind astrology. So my point is, isn't it interesting? Astrology is the first science, all right? Then everything broke away from astronomy and medicine. Everything came from astrology first. It was the first science that the Sumerians gave us, and Egyptians went a little bit more haywire with it and passed down through the generations. So people, when they want to be nice, hard-nosed scientists and very, whatever, you have to realize there are metaphysical bases behind this that's not only support, but precede it. So metaphysics always precedes the laws of physics and the more conventional scientific principles that we have today.
Well, that could get us into a whole other question about the vehement denial. I think that, let's face it, I think that there are a lot of what we call material scientists that are surmising themselves that that's the case, and yet there's this vehement, denial about acknowledging that. So,
from a philosophical point of view, scientists are materialists. Their attitude is nothing exists that you can't observe. There's no God, there's no soul. That's what a materialist would say. Obviously, I don't follow that principle, even though I was trained that way. But thank goodness we all have a Fifth Amendment rights here. Then you have the Eastern philosophy, which is what's called monistic idealism, which simply says that the planet that we observed around us represents the Mayas, or the illusions of the Earth plane, that the only thing that really exists is consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
You see, and the consciousness would be the soul, would be the higher self, would be the God energy complex, you see. And then there's an in-between mentality where it's kind of a compromise where they say, well, you have these other forces, but the soul is actually created by the brain. Wrong. It's the energy that creates physical matter. Think of it from a perspective of, I'll use my logic and my scientific background with a metaphysical slant. When the Big Bang Theory occurred, and we have a ton of evidence that 13.7 billion years ago, there was one heck of a Big Bang, okay? So what happened? The universe was created. What do you think was created first, energy or matter? We know from Einstein, E equals mc squared. Energy can be converted to matter, and matter can be converted to energy, right? Mm-hmm. Well, guess what? For 500 million years after the Big Bang, the only thing that exists in the universe was energy.
That's right.
Heat, radiation, light, whatever. Then matter was created. So if the God energy complex in its infinite wisdom decided to create energy first, what do you think matters most in the universe? When I say matters, that's a pun. It's energy, and the energy represents our soul, the higher self, the God energy complex, etc. So we're dealing with an energy-based mentality, and energy, everything else comes from that. And that's why I think the Easterners are right, that consciousness is everything.
That's right.
That we may be living in a black hole right now and just creating all the flowers and plants and miniature schnauzers named karma, just to get us through the day and there's some pleasures in life.
Absolutely. Well, I couldn't concur with you more. Getting back to our story, and obviously all of this is related, but I want to make mention of your wonderful book, Exploring the Fifth Dimension. Crosses so many of the things that we're discussing today. It's subtitled Parallel Universes, Teleportation, and Out-of-Body Travel. And you say that reincarnation, you say in your book that reincarnation utilizes the fifth dimension as its mechanism. Is this where Jean and her snorkeling partner went? Were they in the fifth dimension?
Oh, no question. When you mention, anytime you mention an altered state, you're talking about an alpha brainwave level on a medical level, but now you're talking about observing something that is not perceivable by people on the three-dimensional Earth plane today, namely the gates, the Atlantean mentality, and the hills and all that kind of stuff. Nobody else would observe that now. So in order to do that, you have to understand that our physical body, our eyes, ears, all our five senses, etc., can only observe three dimensions in our physical body on the Earth plane. You enter into the space-time continuum. This is now time is considered the fourth dimension. It's a theoretical concept for the math. And then anything beyond time would be the fifth dimension. That would be like the astral plane that people report about when they have out-of-body experiences. Parallel universes that not only is involved with my Exploring the Fifth Dimension book, but others too that I've written, talk about how you have the universe that we have today, but there are parallel universes, which is fully supported by quantum physics, by the way, and the M theory and the string theories, where you and I are existing on different universes that are physical. These aren't, metaphysical. These are physical universes that you and I can't observe unless we enter into the altered state, because now you have to go beyond the three-dimensional mentality. So this is called the fifth dimension. It's perfectly part of the equation. Scientists they can argue all they want about it, but you can't argue math, and it exists, and it's part of our mentality. So anytime you have a metaphysical or spiritual or religious experience, whatever term you want to use, you're talking about the fifth dimension, and that would be an example of Jean and Lisa's experience.
Well, Jean and Lisa were privy to this fifth dimension and perhaps layers of previous lives that they were a part of. Why did this happen to Jean and Lisa and not to the others? Why does this happen for some people and not others?
Well, first of all, they most likely had a karmic tie together, which makes it relevant, since they shared the past life in Atlantis with Solon. Let's not forget the Solon life.
That's right.
And secondly, it's like, why are some people more psychic and more intuitive than others? It's a natural ability, but it also is a timing as to their higher self to teach them lessons, to learn lessons of the universe. Not just the lessons of how to, make eggs in the morning for your family, but I'm talking about more metaphysical, more spiritual. It's for their own spiritual growth and their karmic aspect. Because when you mentioned briefly, let's just talk about the concept in my Exploring the Fifth Dimension book about reincarnation is the mechanism, or out-of-body experiences is the mechanism of reincarnation. Of course, let's just quickly talk about it. A person clinically dies, crosses into spirit. That means the soul leaves the body. The silver cord is severed. They're not coming back to that body. That body will eventually now fertilize the lawn, so to speak. So what happens to the soul? The soul goes from the earth plane into the astral plane, usually the lower astral plane, then to the upper astral plane. Then it goes through a very complicated cycle and eventually winds up at what we call the soul plane, which is now in the fifth dimension, and then eventually will choose a new body and reincarnate. But in order to get from step plan A or location 1, namely the earth plane and the physical body, to the soul plane, eventually a new body, you have to deal with the idea of out-of-body experiences, because what's traveling is the soul. The soul is the life force. The prana of the East Indians, we call it the subconscious mind in more Western mentality. The Chinese call it the chi, the Japanese the ki. It's all the same thing.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is that from a statistical point of view, or from a logic, if people want to play the logic game here, isn't it interesting, and what's the odds, that all throughout history, all around the world, the cultures that we have that eventually led to our civilizations today all report the same phenomena.
Yes, that's
There's
right.
a law, as a scientist, I'm also a trained scientist, I got 3 degrees in it. There's a law, this is not a theory, it's a law. You know, Einstein's theory of relativity is a theory, okay? It's not considered a law, although in reality it works. And by the way, Einstein did not get his Nobel Prize in the theory of relativity. He got it in the photoelectric effect, because the Scandinavians thought that it would be disavowed in the future. How's that for politics? But getting back to a law, there's a law called Whately's Law of Evidence. It's a very strict law in science, which says this: if people from all over the world with no communication all report the same event, it must be true. That's a law in science today. It's called Whately's Law of Evidence. Well, guess what? People from all over the world have reported out-of-body experiences forever. We assumed, unless you believe in Atlantis and Lemuria, which I do, but my colleagues don't in the hard sciences, that they didn't have communication with that. They weren't ancient travelers going around the world in 20,000 BC. That these cultures all report the flood. They all report various experiences of fifth dimension, of energy vortices, of UFO observations. All these kinds of things have been reported by people from all over the world with supposedly no communication, which means they're accurate. It's as simple as that, and that's supported by science. So these phenomena, isn't it interesting how the soul has been described forever? Today, we have now evidence that the soul actually exists, especially William Tiller's work at Stanford University.
That's right.
Emeritus, among others. Rupert Sheldrake from England with his morphogenic fields, etc. We have a lot of evidence that we have a soul, okay, which is an alpha brain wave. It's the mentality here. So again, this is where science is starting to support metaphysical disciplines that we've known for thousands of years on a more regimented and specific level. So these things are starting to marry together. Again, you're going to get a lot of hard-nosed scientists that don't believe, just like you're not going to get Democrats or Republicans to agree on anything, okay? So that doesn't mean they're right. It simply means that they disagree.
Right.
And again, the whole point here is the math supports it. Quantum physics, which scientists love to make fun of, except quantum physicists, simply has the math. You cannot argue the math.
Right, right. I would agree with that. Well, I know that when we visited with you in California back in February, and my husband accompanied us, who happens to be an attorney, you talked about Whately's Law of Evidence, and he nodded his head in the affirmative. Yes, I'm absolutely familiar with that, so that's a very good point to make. And yet, as much as Whately's evidence states that if something is experienced and it's ubiquitous by lots of people.
In this particular case in law, this would be the credibility of a witness of an event, whether it's a crime or a civil or a tort, if you will, in a civil situation. When you get witnesses that are credible and independently report the same thing, that's evidence that can be used in court. So he would be familiar with that from an evidentiary point of view.
Absolutely, absolutely. Bruce, I want to talk a little bit about, I want to transition and talk about some of the great things that you're doing now as we wind down. I know that you have in the past given workshops on the history of Atlantis and Lemuria and Egypt, and I guess what you do is you focus on leading people or guiding, facilitating people to perhaps past lives in which they lived during those times. Are you still doing that workshop, that particular one?
Oh yeah, I do workshops on past life regression and future life progression is what you're referring to. I also do separate workshops, or a different one, on out-of-body experiences, what I call fifth-dimensional experiences, which includes ascension techniques. I also, as part of this, also deal with, and this would refer to the past life regression and future life progression workshops, where people are trained to contact time travelers from our future, which is part of the both Exploring the Fifth Dimension book and the Egypt book that I alluded to earlier. So they're trained to have their own subjective experiences, not just to confirm my research, but for their own. Remember, the whole point of this is not titillation. You know, this is not like going to a spa or putting cucumbers on your eyelids here. This is for your own spiritual growth. This is the reason why we have these experiences.
That's right.
In fact, people should understand this too, is that, a lot of people are afraid of hypnosis. Let's just quickly, disseminate the reality here. Hypnosis is a natural daydream experience. We all go through it for 4 hours during the waking day, 3 hours during your dream or REM cycles at night. If it wasn't for natural hypnosis, which is an alpha brainwave medically or neurologically, people would die of stress. They'd get a heart attack or a stroke. So we absolutely need this. It's necessary for life because it functions to de-stress us. But at the same time, on a spiritual level, it's the mechanism that is helping us to, let's say, evolve our soul into a higher level, which will lead to eventual ascension, where we no longer have to reincarnate and we can rejoin the God energy complex. So it's a very, very important, almost surgical technique that is given to us by Mother Nature, God energy complex, whatever term you want to use. And this is not something that is just a mechanical procedure, just like a woman learning how to birth a baby. This is very far beyond this as an energy perspective, because remember, the universe is energy first. Matter was an afterthought. Okay? The energy is everything. If you want to deal with anything in life, you focus in on the energy first. Everything else will fall into place. If you violate universal laws, if you do stupid things or ignore advice and just try to play games of selfishness or whatever, you're going to have a problem.
Right.
So here, following the universal laws, you can be healthy, you can be wealthy and wise, to quote Benjamin Franklin without having to get up too early, and you can follow the universal laws, and that's how we can grow as a soul. And if everybody did this, we'd have a much more pleasant planet than we have today.
Well, I certainly hope that that's the case, that more people get to have the profound experiences like Jean and Lisa, and that we understand that these are central to our, not just our survival, but in order for us to thrive, we need to envelop ourselves in these experiences and perhaps initiate some of them. So, Dr. Goldberg, I want to thank you so much for this absolutely fascinating subject, and I know that you're adept at this and so much more in these wonderful subjects. I want to give you a special thank you because you have been kind enough to sign a copy of one of your wonderful books, Egypt, Extraterrestrials and Time Traveler Experiments. That's for Jean, so she can learn a little bit more about her experience. So thank you for that.
Well, and I thank you for the opportunity to disseminate this information to your audience here and have people learn something that they probably haven't been too inundated with in the past, yet something that can help them, not just from an interesting point of view, but to help them to grow spiritually, because that's really the whole point of all this.
That's right, and that's why we're doing what we're doing, and it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
With other forces at work in this universe, despite some who may dismiss the possibility of encounters such as Jean's, Dr. Goldberg reminds us that just because we don't have a current explanation for how all things work on this vast planet doesn't mean they don't exist. There are geophysical forces, ley lines, and energy vortices that may be leading to a tear in the fabric of space and time, which would make stories like Jean's all the more plausible. As the great physicist and philosopher Richard Feynman once said, "It does no harm to the mystery to know a little bit about it." Thank you for listening to Higher Journeys. Until next time, I'm Alexis Brooks.